Hey everybody. So as you could probably see, this is offline, no chat, and what I wanted to do was touch base because there's been some confusion around the integral series. What I want to be really clear with is that this is not necessarily my views. This is the views as put forth by Wilbur and other integral thinkers as I remember them. There's something that's kind of happened in regards to this series where I've gotten a lot of pushback that feels like it's based around this idea that I'm asserting certain things or that there aren't critiques to be made here, and there absolutely are. In fact, one of the things I plan on doing in the near future is one of the videos is going to be about my critiques against integral theory and some of the things that I really struggle with it. But I also want to be clear that this is a really useful map. It's a map that helped me figure out to go to school. It's a map that helped me figure out to go into Zen. It's a map that figured out how to help me have a bigger and more nuanced perspective. So I just wanted to touch base with you guys about that and let you know. So the intention of this is not you must use this. It's something to consider, something to play with. But I would hold off on really aggressive judgments until such time as you see the entire map laid before you, you take some time to let it gel within you, and then you make a decision from there. That's all I ask. All right? All right. Love you guys. Enjoy. Hey everyone, so we're back at it again. We're going to be talking about integral theory as I learned it. Now remember, this is a crash course. Going into the nuances of this and the full sort of interpretations of it is way longer than a fucking video should be. So my goal is to keep these short and sweet and then answer questions at the end. Thank you, Kira. I really appreciate that. So what are we talking about today? We're going to be going over one of the major pieces of integral theory, one of the 5 major components of it. And I want to front load before we get into this why this shit matters. Okay? I've been getting a lot of comments and a lot of questions through DMs about, why the hell are we going over this, or what is the point of it, or people jumping to weird ass conclusions and not listening to the video. The purpose of this map, in my humble opinion, is it's very good for making descriptive statements about reality as it is perceived. That is that I cannot know reality beyond what I perceive of it. And as such, we know for a fact that there appears to be human development, at least as far as we can map. There appears to be different directionality of perspectives, and those perspectives seem to lead to different philosophies and disciplines. And then we're going to be today getting into stages. We're going to be talking about the stages of development specifically that I mentioned just a moment ago because they need to be looked at. The states are important because you need to understand this map includes everything. Now you want to call those brain states, random misfires, psychedelics, hallucinatory breaks, whatever the fuck you want to call them. I don't care. The point here is not to make a prescriptive statement as to what these things are. I'm not saying this is what they must be because I said so. What I'm saying is descriptively, all of these different aggregate experiences seem to be under this umbrella. Okay? So let's get into it. So as you know, this is the map, and we've already covered states. Those are gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual. We've also covered quadrants, right? These 4 perspectives, I, we, it, and its. Or another way to say that is subjective, objective, intersubjective, and interobjective. That is, if you break down human perception, all of it seems to fundamentally break down to perspectives on perspectives. When we talk a little bit more about integral methodological pluralism, we'll get into that more. But right now, what this is essentially breaking down to is that you can look at any of these 4 quadrants and understand them as being just different disciplines. In the subjective category, we have psychology. In the objective, we have neurology. In the we space, or the intersubjective, we could have culture. And in the interobjective, we could have economy, or nation states. States as a systemic entity, right? But what we're going to talk about today is this part. This fucking mess. Okay. Hey, Walter. So, why does this matter? It seems to matter, at least from my perspective, because what we're trying to do is, in any given situation, trying to understand other humans' behavior and understand why groups of people behave as they do. Right? So let me say that again. One of the things that we have to understand is why people do what they do and why certain groups of people behave the way they do. There appears to be some sort of logic in the irrationality. Another way to say that is, somewhere buried in the chaos, there appears to be order. So, let's get into this. First, we're just going to be looking at levels. All right? And as you can see, this is a pretty colorful system. It moves up these different things. Wilbur color-coded each of these as different ways to shorthand them. But today I want to talk about almost more exclusively these different aspects that we see in the world on average. The reason for that is that, and this is going to sound a bit elitist, but I can't help it, this is just the numbers. I'm not going to talk as much about these upper states, either because, one, we have less coherent data about them, and two, they only account for less than maybe 1% of the population, right? Like, we're talking about a very, very small percent of humanity that seems to get to these stages. And this isn't some sort of like mystic quest bullshit. This isn't some sort of like, you're trying to do this to join the cult. It's nothing like that. These are stages that every human being goes through their development, from tiny little wee baby, little babu, to all the way up to adulthood. And what you'll find with this system is that, unfortunately, a number of people are walking around as children with about 30 years experience being a 12-year-old. It's unfortunate, and some of those people run the country. So let's get into this. So, right here we have the first level, what Wilbur color codes as infrared, or is what is called the instinctive self in spiral dynamics, right? Values development. Ages 0 to 18. This exists as survival bands, started 100,000 years ago. Do what you must to stay alive, undifferentiated from environment, narcissism, quest for food, water, warmth, and shelter. So this would be the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, right? Next, magic or animistic self, 1 to 3 years. Tribal order, started around 50,000 years ago. Egocentric, impulsive, keep the spirits happy and the tribe's nest warm and safe. Magical thinking. Quest, safe mode of living. Security. Method, petition to the gods and powers with ritual. Pitfalls, borderline, narcissism, omnipotent fantasy, tribal conflict, etc. Right? And we're not poking anyone or being mean about this, but we're just simply saying is that, like, for example, let's look at little kids. Let's say you have a kid that's aged 1 to 3. A kid who's 1 to 3, by definition, exists basically still relatively fused with their environment. They exist in a way in which they are basically just part of their family, their group system, right? Their tribe system, whatever you want to call it. And it really is just finding ways to be secure, ways to connect. Little kids, toddlers and the like, are magical thinking. That isn't a bad thing. That's just how kids are. This is why a little kid can believe in the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus, right? This is just how they function. It's magical thinking. Now, granted, when this comes with the adult and becomes part of their general way of thinking, say that Jesus turned water into wine, or that a man could somehow have enough biodiversity with just two of each type of animal on a giant fucking boat, then it gets problematic, because now you're trying to base things on basically child logic. The next stage, and for any of you who have kids, you'll probably know this one, Power Self, age 3 to 6. Early mythic, feudal, and exploitive empires starting 10,000 years ago. Aggression, might makes right, be and do what you want regardless. So this would be the age of Beowulf. This would be the age of heroes, right? The Greeks fall into this to some degree. This idea of warlord power claiming. What you see as far as, say, children is a child who's around 3 to 6. They're little egocentric beings running around being jerks. Sometimes they're cute, sometimes they're sweet, but there's a tendency to almost overly almost fantasize their behavior or their intentions. In reality, they're just sort of little needs machines. They do what they want, and if they can get away with it, they'll do what they have to get those needs met, right? These are the kids you have to teach not to hit their friend with a stick just because their friend took a toy, right? These are the kids like myself who at age like 5 was standing on their front porch in the 80s holding up a plastic sword screaming for the, by the power of Grayskull. And again, this was really solid. But again, each of these stages is by their definition an evolution off the previous. What you're watching as we go through these is the unfolding of consciousness. And now I know I will do a piece later at the end that talks about some of the critiques I can make about this. Actually, yeah, I would argue that if you want to make a comparison, Saul, here's a funny thing. Right here, the tube above that we'll talk about in a minute, you have rules, role, self, rational self, right? Hey, Minerva. These are actually in Piaget's cognitive system, concrete rational and formal rational thinking, right? This empire, the idea of might makes right, die for the cause. Yeah, it's absolutely childish logic. Fascism is not based on reasoning. It's based on arguments of intuitiveness and simple emotional appeal. Don't you feel why things are so bad? Blame group here. Be a hero for the cause. Hell, you could even make an argument here that at this point, the enemy doesn't so much matter, for the enemy is always bad. Anything that scares you is bad. Yes, so Sailor, I would say that, like, part of the thing is that these... We'll get to this in a little bit, but there are various ways that people kind of inhabit these stages throughout their life. We may not always be flying at the highest stage of development we're at, right? You have good days, you have bad days. But yeah, make sure to put those in the integral segments questions. But basically, long story short is, yeah, you're accurate. You can move through these a little bit. And also, Lines explains this to some degree too. We'll talk about those in a minute. But basically, there's a way that this stuff interacts that's really fascinating. Let's move on. You're okay, Looney. No worries. Rules role self, age 7 to 8. Late mythic, nation states, authoritarian, right? So this is what fascism turns into. Absolutist, religious. Starting 5,000 years ago, ethnocentric, life has meaning, direction, right? So I would argue to some degree, I think they're great. I just don't think they're the only sources of data, Patella. So what I would argue is to some degree, this is actually the underlying system of fascism. This is the aesthetic of fascism. Does that make sense? Life has meaning, direction, purpose with predetermined outcomes. Quest, ultimate peace, good versus evil. Method, fit in, follow the given rules, don't exceed your role, discipline, faith, pitfalls, archetypal information, script pathology, fundamentalism, fascism. Yeah. Yeah. This is, by definition, I think, what happens when you take a fascist person and make a fascist group. Tony, I don't know if I have data on that, but yeah, probably. I mean, yeah, I can't diagnose people at distance, especially dead people, but Agreed, Minerva. So in Piaget's system, this would be concrete rational. This is the kid that has like very basic early rational thinking, but they can't do like, say, conservation very well. Like, for example, if they pour like a really tall graduated cylinder or do a really fat one, they'll think they actually are different amounts of liquid, even if they say they're the same, because they're not formal rational thinkers. They're not based on the quantities, the numerics, the reasoning. They're based on sort of early rationale. This is what you see in kids who are 7 to 8, right? They can come to some really cool outcomes. But this is also where they start fitting in with other kids. This is where gender roles take over. I would argue that gender roles can happen at these lower stages, but they almost seem to be more, and I know I'm getting in trouble with feminists over this, but sorry. I would argue that to some degree, early variations tended to be more about power and more about specifically what seemed to work at the time. And by work, I don't mean what was effective or moral or good, but what was effective in the sense that it allowed society and the tribe to survive and move on. When we get to here, this is where I think concreted gender roles come in. But this is also interesting because even this has evolutions, right? Before the last couple hundred years, the idea of a state as it exists, right? Or the idea of a nation, right? France used to be tons of little tiny fiefdoms in different areas, and they all spoke different levels of French and all different types of French. And then suddenly France came together as a nation and they just codified the motherfucker. Right? Each of these stages moves up degrees because they're all building off one another. We'll talk about their interactions in a little bit, but do you see how they build off one another, right? To gain an ego or a sense of ego, you first have to have the support of the tribe, right? There has to be the sort of basic animalistic behavior, instinctive self, and eventually out of that comes a ego, right? Early, very self-focused. Moving on to a rules role. Groups get together. Even if there's still that underlying notion of power, there still is a way in which we go by this. If you want to see a really dumb but really fantastic variation of this explanation, I would actually watch Patton Oswalt's comedy special where he talks about sky cake. Because if you ever want to understand power self versus rules role self, perfect explanation. He basically says, you got these guys wandering around. I'm going to butcher this. You have these guys wandering around. They got like axes. They're up there, you know, doing forced adult fun time on people just randomly. And then some guy comes up and goes, if you stop doing that stuff, we'll give you sky cake when you die. And the person's like, well, I do like killing, but I like cake more. And so you convince them through rules roles self to behave themselves for some kind of ultimate reward. Because not only are the evolutions building off one another, they're also reactions to each other, right? How do you deal with a warlord? How do you deal with warlord states? Well, you build a nation state. You build something like, feudalism.
which you could still argue is very close to the warlord state, but it is in some ways like early mythic, feudal, and exploitive empires. You get towards, like they say, the Renaissance, a much more complicated issue. Life has meaning, direction, purpose, predetermined outcomes, right? Look, you're going to go to heaven, get sky cake. Wait, that group over there believes when they die, they're going to get sky pie? Fucking kill them. Like, that's the problem here. And this is where we get into it. The previous levels are reactive by their nature. But rules role self by its nature is still reactive, but differently. It's reactive in the sense that it's entirely based out of rigidly sort of holding society in a particular way. The problem is, and this is where shit gets complicated, is that when that shit happens, suddenly those guys across the pond look real evil. Because, and this is their nature, two worldviews, whether these are people, whether these are nations, and we'll talk about how that interacts with the quadrants, you're already starting to get it, to interact with one another, if they believe they are the good, right? They're the ones that are believing in God. They are the ones that absolutely are following God's will. Well, if they're both thinking that, and they are, if they disagree on things, then all of a sudden, how do you prove that? Well, you reactively attack them, right? Militarism and eventually barbarism, right? You regress. Next, we have rational self, age 9 to 14. Capitalistic democracies, starting 300 years ago, scientific rationalism, world-centric, acts from self-interest by playing the game to win, market-driven meritocracy, quest, rational truth, material pleasure, in defense of civilization. Method, science, learn to excel, set goals, achieve measurable success. Pitfalls, scientism, flatland, identity crisis, role confusions, consumerism, ecological crisis, workaholism, goal fixation, overattachment to successful methods, denial of spirit. Take that last one for whatever your fucking mileage is. But essentially, around 9 to 14, if everything goes well in your development, you kind of end up getting kind of a basic rational understanding. We start teaching kids fucking the scientific method during this time. We start teaching kids the basics of chemistry, biology, etc. And the reason for that, and why we push them on high school and all that stuff, is that's not just based around random nonsense. That's based on development. We do this. The problem with this is that it tends to be hyper-individualistic. You're trying to win the game, but if you win, everyone loses. In some ways, I would say one of the major pathologies of this stage of development can become libertarianism, right-leaning, of course. The other problem is, as we mentioned in the quadrants video, this is a flatland issue. And that is what I mean by that is when you watch the quadrants video, there's a discussion saying one of the big problems is that different disciplines or different perspectives will sometimes reduce the other perspectives down to the singular one. And this is the best example for it, which is flatlanding. Scientism, that is the idea that only science matters, can turn into things like limited materialism or other really bizarre philosophies. But essentially, when you reduce all of human experience down to just the scientific singularity, right? The idea of, we're just these brains, and these brains give off neurochemicals, and that's the whole of the experience, right? It doesn't matter whether love exists or not, because all that is brain chemicals, right? It's the bullshit line from Rick and Morty, right? The first season where he's like, it just compels people to breed and then it fades off, hits fast and, hits hard and then fades off. The fact is that, yeah, there's a truth to that. And it doesn't reduce the notions of love or the experiences of crushes or lust or anything like that. We can't reduce any quadrant to the other. And the thing is unfortunately, this stage of development has a really bad habit. We're talking about this one. Has a really bad fucking habit of doing it. So here's where we get to the top part of what Wilber would call first tier. And you can buy into that construct or not. Sensitive self, age 15 to 21. Social democracies, informational, started about 150 years ago. That is, by the way, when I say it started X number of years ago, what we're talking about is that stage of development was only seen rarely before that time, right? The notions of ecology or pluralism or things like that weren't a thing before 150 years ago. They were evolutions of consciousness, ways of thinking. Also, this is the stage of development based on Wilber's description that is the one that gets him in the most fucking trouble. Started 150 years ago, pluralism seeks inner peace within a caring community. Power with solidarity, human rights activism. Quest, peace, affectionate relations, beneficial resolutions, dialogue, and consensus. Method, appreciative diverse views, listen well, consensus, empathize group needs, marginalize no one. Pitfalls, nihilism, inauthenticity, excessive relativism, lack of discernment, endless consensus, heartless irony. Yeah, kind of, Tony. So you can already see where this probably got Wilber in trouble, is that people started using this to demonize ways of thinking that are relatively leftist, right? Because there are pitfalls. We see this in the left. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to show this map to you all, is that inauthenticity, right? This notion of not being real with one another. There's something truthful buried in that when you take away the conservative nonsensory around, whatever. Lack of discernment, right? So actually looking at different cultures and going, okay, what is the actual material outcomes of these cultures? How do we judge this, or is it just everybody flatland, doesn't matter? In a lot of ways, what this is trying to break down is that in some ways each of these stages of development is a evolution on the previous, right? So it's like, let's start from here. Here you just have survival, but survival is fucking awful. So what you do is tribal order comes about. The need for warmth, connection, early family, early tribe systems. And guess what? In this stage of development, life has meaning. You petition to the gods. When lightning strikes, guess what? Zeus is fucking mad. Cool. But beyond just the meaning of the gods, it doesn't really do anything beyond the warmth of the family. So what happens is you start having organization. And how does organization always start off? Might makes right, which builds into the hero myth. We have Gilgamesh, we have Beowulf, etc. But that doesn't work because that just leads to warlords, right? People bringing down axes and stealing your women and all these other awful fucking things that have happened throughout history ad nauseum. So eventually you codify the system. People start to think in rigid ways. This is the way it must be. We see this in a large percentage of the United States. In fact, I would argue in most first world countries, this is Wilber's argument, 70% of the United States falls into this realm. So we have a bunch of people wandering around who are basically 8-year-olds with years of experience being 8-year-olds. I know that sounds shitty, but that sucks. This explains why when you argue with conservatives, they petition to tradition, to intuition, to common sense. This is why there's no reasoning and logic in what they do. That's why they don't give a fuck about consistency, because consistency is a rational self-issue. Eventually, you realize these systems are fucked because they're authoritarian as hell and they cause people to die and they seem arbitrary. So then you do this one, and it's like, okay, we'll do democracies. But we'll do democracies, unfortunately, because of the self-interested aspect of that stage of development. Spoiler, it sabotages itself. You know what? All men are created equal. You know what we mean, right? Like, it's suddenly clear that because of the self-interested aspects of your group, right? All of a sudden, you've sabotaged the notion of democracy. Suddenly, black people, other indigenous people, or women aren't allowed to be a part of the vote. Because, well, Why would men give up the power unless they were forced to? In some ways, this stage of development realigns itself with whoop, that was way too big. It realigns itself with the individualism of this previous stage in the sense where it becomes very self-focused, but it comes out of a rational self-interest rather than just power. Though I would say to some degree, these two can be conflated. But once you play with this system, as I said, there are pitfalls. You start to realize, like, for example, all of the fucking issues with capitalism, that there's problems in there. There are built-in hierarchies, and those hierarchies are garbage. Not all hierarchies are garbage. I'll say the thing that no one likes. But the fact is that a lot of the hierarchies have built-in assumptions that often hurt people. They cause damage, they cause marginalization, they cause systemic damage, etc. In fact, one of these upper levels, which we'll talk about another time, is actually about reintegrating the notion of healthy hierarchies. We'll talk about this probably in another video. I just want to get through these things. And so what I want you to understand from these levels of development is not only do they stem from one another, they also react to one another. They're reactions to the previous, because humanity tends to come to a sort of developmental paradigm and then shift to the next one, you'll notice. And here's the joke, at least this is Wilber's argument. I don't know how much this is true, but Wilber argues 100,000, 50,000, 10,000, 5,000. It's speeding up. This is jumping at a fairly quick rate. So how does this work with politics? Let's bring up the hard one. I would say most of the current left is around here. They are somewhere between what Wilber would color code as orange or green, either looking to be as rational and consistent as possible. This would fall into sort of the destinies, right? And I would say some of the more, much more focused on social justice and things like that tend to fall more into here. The problem is the people we're dealing with are here. The right, at least their argumentation and the way in which their voters function and move through their lives and world and all that, seems to be about here, which is fine, except things get complicated. The reason why I don't have a problem calling conservatism fascism is that I don't see them as fundamentally different. They're different in aesthetic, they're different in argumentation around democracy, but basically they come down to the same problem. You can already see how this is basically the language of the conservative, right? This is the language of your Ted Cruz's and your Donald Trumps. That's not democracy. They don't give a fuck about democracy. They play to it because it plays the cheap seats, but it doesn't matter. So the issue is we have two large groups crashing into one another, and these aren't discrete, which means they crash into one another and flow into one another. This is why we have what we have. Correct, Saul. You can actually see the conflict there where Marx would have absolutely been at this stage of development. Right? You can actually, and that's the other thing, you can look at these stages of development not just as your individual stages of development, and you can actually start looking at these with people's work, with governments. You can actually see how things function in much larger ways. Again, obviously cutting out some of the details, but just making a quick shorthand. So I want to bring up one last thing, and then we're going to get into questions. I know this took a while, but this is a really important part of this map, so I want to get clear with it. What Wilber identified, and I'm going to say this twice, what Wilber identified is that there are three movements within here. There is pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. I'll say that again. There are three major movements within here that seem to be the way consciousness moves. There is pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Now, what does that mean? I'll give you an example. One of the things Wilber identified was the thing called the pre-post fallacy. And that was the idea that the pre-conventional and the post-conventional were very hard to tell apart. So here's the example. If you look in the 70s, when you would see, like, in the 60s or 70s, you would see like animal rights groups where they would be like trying to fight for animal rights, right? That was their big deal. They wanted to save animals, take them out of the labs, etc. On one side, you'd have people who were all about, you know, free love, consciousness. They wanted these animals to be free because that was a really important, like, value to them. Right? But in the same movement, you would have people like this who would be like, because that animal being sad makes me angry, we should, again, this is an example, YouTube, bomb that place. Right? So instead of taking action in a way that reduces harm, fuck it, do it live. MW, thank you for subscribing. So please understand that. Now here's the problem, and here's where the pre-post fallacy comes in. Post-conventional cannot discern itself from pre-conventional because the direct decision to not want to marginalize or in some way not call out people's behavior means you can't actually identify this because it's almost allergic to hierarchy. Because it's a level of development that was created in reaction to hierarchies. It can't notice the hierarchy between pre and post-conventional. You see this in the left all the time. Right? Social justice warriors, tankies, right? Like, and so this gets one step more complicated. Post-conventional can't tell itself from pre-conventional. They just think they're just wild kids, but they're really uncomfortable with some of their violence. And they're like, you probably shouldn't do that. Conventional, on the other hand, is going, you're all fuckwits. Because this stage of development can't conceive of the ones above it. They don't exist. These are not just like windows you put on your head. They are literally worldviews. These are worlds people live in. This is how they see the world. And because these worldviews each have different greater levels of complexity, this level does not understand that this level exists. This is why your motherfucking climate change deniers can't understand climate change, because it's a multi-discipline, multi-systemic issue. They don't even understand there's a system, let alone all the things that come from it. Because it's not a rational thing. Climate change is based on what? Like climatology, biology, botany, like we're looking at all these different systems. So because it can't tell anything about this, it thinks post-conventional is pre-conventional. Correct, Minerva, but even if you're at conventional, you still can't tell. There's still no discernment. There's still no development. You still can't tell the difference. One just seems less like an asshole. So that's the joke. Post-conventional cannot discern itself from pre-conventional. Correct, Fesh. Absolutely fucking correct. We really need to do that Matrix night. And that's where Wilbur got pissy about post-conventional. We can get into post-conventional at another discussion. I think that deserves its own. We're already way past time. I just want you guys to understand this. No, Minerva, that makes sense then. That makes sense. So we're going to stop here. And what I'm going to say is this. So we're going to move into question and answers. So for those watching the VOD, we're going to end things here. We're going to move on and do all the stuff that's at the video at the end. For those who are on the stream, we're going to go into questions in just a few minutes, okay? Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. You can also ring the bell if you want to be notified of our videos. If you want to help the channel, you can donate at streamlabs.com/transgirltherapist/tip. You also can become a patron at patreon.com/transgirltherapist. As low as $3, you can support our channel. Thanks for watching.